Welcome to the Nerd Journey Podcast. Our goal is to help you, the technology professional, accelerate your career progression, increase your job satisfaction, and be more effective in your existing role.
We want to bring listeners like you the career advice we wish we'd been given earlier in our careers.
I'm John White, at VJourneyman on Twitter, sharing co-host duties with Nick Cordy at NetworkNerd_.
We're two former IT operations guys who have moved on to pre-sales roles with technology vendors. We have our opinions, but we also like to highlight the journeys of others and see what we can learn from them.
We'd also like to ask for your feedback to make this a conversation, not a one-way broadcast. Email us at nerdjourneypodcast@gmail.com or DM us at nerdjourney on Twitter. So come join us on our nerd journey.
Let's take a trip. Episode 297. Let's go. How does something you didn't expect become a focus area for specialization? For Tad Reeves, a principal architect at Arbery Digital, that started when he said yes to the right opportunity. If you missed part one of our discussion with Tad in episode 296, we talked about his early career, how it started focused on mechanical engineering, quickly switched to graphic design, and then he fell in love with technology. There was a theme of pursuing interest and learning at a deeper level to develop that expertise that actually ended up producing many new opportunities. As we kick off the discussion with Tad in part 2 this week, you'll hear how he incorporated something he loves, graphic design, into the type of technology work he was already doing. Tad shares a really interesting experience he had as a consultant and how it helped him grow from just implementing a solution to architecting one based solely on a single problem statement. He'll give some thoughts on the difference between contract work, full-time work, and what you need to know to determine which one might be right for you. And then we'll hear about the genesis of Tad's specialty surrounding Adobe Experience Manager as we get to part 2 of our discussion with Tad Reeves.
After PlayStation went live, that was my first time of a big website go live. And watching the live traffic come into that thing, where suddenly we had 10,000 visitors crawling all over that thing, I will remember that moment forever. It was exhilarating. Midnight, I actually got in my car and went over to the data center just so I could go and watch those lights just wong, and just this is a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing.
A gentle hum.
Oh yeah.
Well, you're just building things. What did you say before? Building things that people will use and enjoy using.
I think flavors and harmonics of that thrill you can find also in debugging. When you have something that's affecting a broad swath of people, and then you fix it, and it's jamming now, and suddenly it's all working for everybody. I think every time that I found myself in a job where suddenly I'm doing something that doesn't really matter, doesn't really affect anybody, then suddenly I'm almost like a soldier pulled back from the front line kind of a thing. It's like, what am I doing here, guys? Only one person used this app that I'm writing. Do I have to do this?
I would imagine there's a big change in energy because you got the exhilaration of the PlayStation 2 go live, the modem closet, other high points. And then, I wrote this app and spent however many hundreds of hours, and it isn't used very much.
That's true. That sort of thing is rough. So I had a couple other engineers that would work with me on things, but I was overall in charge of the project. There's a couple of those where I was tagged as the lead. I could plug people in to help me out with stuff, or I had at least license to go and grab people to do my rack and stacks for me and things like that if I wanted to. So I didn't need to do all the orange, red, orange, green, white, blue, blue, white, green, brown, white, brown all by myself.
When you say in charge of a project, at that time, did that mean I am in charge of architecting this system to meet these customer requirements and getting the gear procured and installing the operating system and configuring the website? What was the scope of the project, if you don't mind just sharing?
I mean, this is 25 years ago, right? So at this point in time, I guess what you would call that job was more of an implementation engineer.
Mm-hmm.
And so my job definitely wasn't within the scope of what you would call an architect now. I was given a spec. This is the hardware that had already been procured, and my responsibility was to get it up and to pull in whoever I needed to pull in to make it work. And in some cases, it's networking guys, and in some cases it's, I got to coordinate with a vendor, and in some cases it's just the raw work. That in and of itself is fulfilling and wonderful, but that's also a place to grow from, because obviously there are greater and greater spheres of responsibility as you move along.
So after having done those projects and getting the exhilaration, I mean, is that what makes you want to expand your sphere of influence?
Normally one would say yes. I think at this point in my life too, I had a bunch of different things that I would bounce between. Like I still hadn't totally, at this point in time, I still hadn't totally given up on the idea of design work.
Okay.
I still like design work. I still try to do design work whenever I can. It's still fulfilling. So there are times where I would still get myself into website design, and I ended up kind of flipping back onto that for a little while. I worked for a studio that did web development work for a while. And at that point in time, that was just all HTML, CSS, and a little bit of JavaScript. But for the most part, HTML and CSS was what web development was. Plus, it's all Dreamweaver and Fireworks, or whatever we were using back then. I did contract work for a while too, just because I enjoyed that. I had a contract where I built a whole website for the U.S. House of Reps for the Veteran Affairs Committee. That was fun. That was a fun 6 months worth of work, and built something from scratch, and it looked really nice when I was done. I actually got to do a lot of the design work on it too. So I was doing all that Photoshop and showing the comps to people going into the Canon house office building and going in the representative's office, and how do you like this, sir? And I look back fondly on a lot of that experience because I enjoy understanding how the whole cycle works. So getting a chance to do design work and that whole end of just UX work, and you want to do a little drop shadow when I hover over it. Okay, I can do that. All that sort of thing is a very, very, very different problem than I'm getting 500s on this server or something like that. It's a completely different problem, but it doesn't make it any less fulfilling to solve. So did that. I did a couple of web analytics things. Kept kind of dipping back into that well on the WebTrends experience, because I still found that really fascinating. A couple different analytics projects for that web development firm, and then I got a contract to do stuff at Georgia Pacific, where did a whole big web analytics shootout. This is really at the cusp of where web analytics was changing. For people stopped saying, we don't want to necessarily just do logs. We want to use JavaScript and use tracking beacons and so forth. Where there's a couple big players that started to get big right at that time. Omniture, which is now acquired by Adobe, was in there. Hitbox and a couple of these other big names were there. So, but they needed a new analytics stack, and so I was in there. That was my first real time doing big corporate kind of pitch work. What do you need? Requirements gathering, research projects, talking to stakeholders, that sort of thing. I was figuring that out as I went along, because I just was kind of given a project to do. They're like, just do it. And I kind of had to figure out my framework as I went. Turned out it was a fine framework. I look back with embarrassment at a lot of stuff that I've done, but that one I was just pants on fire, just trying to just do it. But it turned out just fine.
So instead of someone saying, hey, you're the project lead, you need to deliver this, and giving you a spec and all the gear and stuff, you have to bake a dish, and you're going to have to figure out what the ingredients are to make the dish that we want.
Right. And not even that. You need to also make one that we like, and we're not going to tell you yet what we like.
You need to give them some samples, right?
Yeah, right. You don't even know if we like barbecue or Korean food. Develop a framework for coming up with requirements from scratch. And then who would you ask? What questions would they have? What would they need? And then come up with that framework, and then figure out, how do you map products against a framework? And then how do you rank those? And then how do you then present that back in a way where they can say, yeah, that's a really good idea.
So you had to develop the success criteria for this project that they then would have to agree on.
That's right.
Because, okay, based on these success criteria, I'm recommending number 1, number 2, and number 3, or something like that.
That's right. It was completely open-ended. And it turned out really well, but you're figuring out the entire cycle from one requirement of, we need web analytics, figure out how to tell us that it's the right one.
Whoa. Now, did that put the same fear in you that you got when you got that systems administration job? Like fear and drive?
I'd say it was more, actually. I already knew a bunch about the product landscape. So at least we were starting from there. But navigating corporate meetings and talking with corporate stakeholders and being in that sort of lion's den, that wasn't my area. I wasn't at home. Here I was, doing it all traveling. So I flew to Georgia and I'm sitting here in a 50-story building by myself trying to figure this out. I had no backup, no PM really to do it. Like it was just figured out. And I think some of those sink or swim moments, necessity can be a driver in some cases.
Oh, yeah. What were some of the things that you had to learn quickly when communicating with these stakeholders that you hadn't really communicated with? Because I'm imagining the stakeholders range from like maybe technical people to management to maybe even executives.
Without knowing that this is what I was doing, it's funny, I listened to that podcast that you did with Max, and really what you have to do is you're just trying to understand even what their problem is. And by the time you've understood what the problem is, you're basically 90% of the way there. And I kind of took it from that. I don't even know what their problem is. All these tools look great, and they all have price tags that make me cry. So I just need to understand what their problem is. And I just started talking to people to understand what the problem was. But once again, I think it was one of these things of like, the only way I'm going to get there is by a lot of conversations. Do I even have time or the luxury to look back in at myself and go, am I good enough to get this done? Should I be embarrassed? This whole like imposter syndrome type of a thing that folks talk about. Like, I don't even have time to think about that. The only way this is going to get done is if I just start talking to people and start setting up meetings and just understand what the problem is.
And did you approach the understanding of problems differently based on the maybe level within the company that the person was, or was it kind of a unified approach?
No, I think it was a unified approach. I think I also didn't know well enough to know when somebody had rank. Because a lot of times you go into a company and you're like, this is the senior VP, and everybody else has got like, oh, I wouldn't go into Mr. Jacobs' office. Well, I have a meeting, I have to meet with him, and I would just go in, kind of a thing.
No intimidation. I love that.
I'll find out later that I should have been intimidated.
Well, a lot of times it takes the pressure off and makes it a lot easier to talk to the person.
I think so. Overthinking these kind of things is sometimes the worst, because you end up with that whole paralysis of like, I want to go, but I can't, sort of a thing.
So you did consulting, contract work. You enjoyed that. What makes you want to go back to working for a full-time company rather than continuing the contract work?
Contract work and full-time work have their strengths and weaknesses. And having done plenty of both, that's a lot of factors, really. I won't say it even boils down to like even a few factors, because there's, with full-time work, especially where you have a delineated job in a large organization, you have the stability of knowing where you sit, having a set of job responsibilities that are handed to you. And a lot of times, too, being able to stop and cut at the end of the day, because you don't have this massive greater responsibility for a small organization or something like that. Or you're not at the same time as you're doing the job also trying to figure out where your next job is going to be. Some people love the hunt of that, and some people are terrified and would do anything to avoid that. And some people, having done it, would want to go the other direction. So I think that there's both types of people. There's also places in life where both of those things make sense.
I know we're recording this at a time of a lot of tech layoffs. Do you think one of those choices is safer than the other right now for listeners? Like look at contract work as an option, or maybe not so much? I don't even know if companies are doing that as much with the layoffs happening.
Not an hour and a half before recording this, I finished a meeting where a stakeholder for a company that I've been working with for 10 years, major company, major brand, that the product owner for this thing just got laid off. And not only did she get laid off, but her boss and her boss's boss all got laid off all in one go. And I had a hard time staying professional, actually. My jaw was on the floor, because it's just one of these things. It's just, how do you summarily lose somebody who's got that much skill, knowledge, and drive and passion for their work? I really feel for folks like that. I don't know that there's a formula for never getting laid off, because in some cases that's not under your control. Especially when you're working for a large company, you can be doing everything brilliantly. You can be at the peak of your career and still be at the adverse end of a layoff. But at the same time, I've found that the only security that I have is in my ability to get a new job. And this is something that I guess I've just, every time my wife has gotten, a little bit freaked out about the job market or something like that, she's like, well, what happens when your contract is up? My job security isn't keeping this job. My job security is knowing that I can get a new job whenever I want to, and being able to have that lined up, so in some cases that comes down to things like, how do you present yourself publicly? Do you have a face not a face, but but a public persona? And also, do you always have your ear to the rail, so to speak, on is the work that you do valuable? Is there lots more work of that around? And if something should happen to your job right now, do you have skills that could be in demand? For a long time, I would cultivate possible careers. So I know Linux now. I could, and I just learned load balancers. And so good. So I could be your networking guy for this. I don't want to do that right now, but I could do that. If I get laid off, I could go do that. I still know servers. I still know this over here. And having those avenues open, I think for me, it's been my mechanism for security, but then also the willingness to get right out there and make sure I can get something done.
And did the contract work, you think, drive you to do that better than the average bear who maybe has never had to hunt a little bit more after 6 months or 3 months?
To a degree, I think, yeah. Some of that drive, didn't come until later. I think that I've had waves of necessity that have driven a lot of the career changes that I've made. I would love to say that I'm just an ambitious technologist, but technology isn't the only ambition that has driven my career changes. It's been a lot of family and things like that too. A better answer to your question is that there are some folks that are at a large company for a long time, and you can end up getting into the feeling that the company is a bottomless pit that can never be exhausted, that it has unlimited resources, and it doesn't matter what you do, the company will always be around. And there's a viewpoint of a lack of personal responsibility for the financial viability of the company and its products and so forth that you can kind of get into if you're in a company of 50,000 people. You're like, oh, well, what honestly am I going to do that is going to make or break this company? So there's a little bit of that. Whereas when you're in a smaller company or consulting, you're like, no, if I don't really knock this out of the park, I'm not getting another job.
Well, you also talked about self-awareness, about, am I enjoying this work? Is it valuable? Back to am I writing this application for one person, or is it going to be used by many? And that self-awareness is something we need to exercise. And sometimes you figure out that things are out of balance. As we were talking before the recording, you mentioned a specific point where things did get out of balance between work and life. Can you maybe speak to the circumstances around that, how you worked through it, and some suggestions for listeners in the same boat?
Yeah, sure. This is a bit later on in life. We had our first baby in 2009. At the time, I was working for a small software development company. And then I ended up getting a contract. And then I had another thing with the U.S. State Department for a while. That was my last like real full-time development job where I was a developer. I was doing cold fusion.
Oh, wow.
Nice people that I worked with, but there's so many of these little political feather in the cap personal projects that happen in the government. Like I was developing full-time for an application that had like 9 users. It was extraordinarily unfulfilling. That was a low point. I'm getting paid. They're paying me. And I'm doing the work that in a normal company brings value. But what are the results of my actions doing? Even the best work that I can do will now affect just 9 users who will use this once every week. This is out of balance from how much is my work exchanging with others in the world kind of a thing. So there was that. I was doing consulting work. We had a new baby. It was kind of working. I was doing a bunch of JavaScript, some geo map stuff and stuff like that, UI work. And it was great. User interface work. This is my first time where I wasn't really working in an office either. I was doing a lot of work from home, and I was doing work that never really stopped. We had some demanding clients that needed to get stuff done, and I'm still working and it's late. And then my wife comes to me and she's like, we're having another baby. And I'm like, okie doke. Let me clarify my reaction. I really love dadding. So that wasn't the part of the reaction. It was, how do I make this all work? Because at the time, it was okay work, but living in Washington, D.C., you need to be at a very high pay scale in order to survive. I was living in Falls Church, which didn't really understand it at the time, but it was a ridiculously expensive suburb of DC. I mean, at that point in time, this is in 2009, and $65,000 a year was the poverty line, basically. So you essentially, you got to make money. And so that was where I'm like, okay, 2 things got to happen right now. I need a lot more money, and I'm not about to go and throw away my whole dadding time by working from home all the time and never really being present for my kids.
Good for you.
I made a very conscious decision at that time. And this is something that also I think has kind of served me well, is that sometimes if you really want something, You can't just say, well, I really wish something was different. You haven't actually named anything out exactly. You got to actually name out precisely what you want. Everything. Like, I should be working in this type of office. I want to be doing this type of work. I want to be doing it this type of schedule. I want this type of thing ahead of me. You name it out exactly, that things tend to fall in place once you've really named it out. And so I did that, and I ended up falling into a job. Really, I just kind of applied for couple of things, and somebody reached out to me on LinkedIn. I was like, how about this? And this was my first job. This is my job at AARP. It's a great job, actually. I learned a lot there. So it was a sysadmin job, Linux sysadmin.
Mm-hmm.
And AARP at the time was one of the largest membership organizations in the world. Huge emailing list. It's a big company, does a lot of great things for retired folks and for older folks. They had a web property, which I really felt strongly about, because I've seen older folks really kind of just fall down when they don't have activities to do. You're really trying to activate people and have them live their best life. Good. I'm on. Let's do it. There's a guy who was leaving that I was kind of replacing, and he was their F5 guy. F5, it's a type of load balancer. I don't know F5, but tell you what, I'm going to learn F5. I'm going to be your F5 guy. And so I did everything I needed to do to get certified for F5. I worked there for a couple of years. Part of this, just to circle back onto the other requirements of this, I wanted to have a job specifically where I could go home at the end of the night, and so that I could just cut. And I basically said, okay, I cannot be in the consulting realm right now, because consulting, you're always looking for you're always doing pitches, you're always like finishing off for a customer. You're paid by the job, and doesn't matter how long you take, so you got to do it even if it takes longer than you wanted, sort of a thing. I needed control over my schedule. That was an intentional life change that I made at that point. You have any idea how many walks and hikes and stuff I got to take with my kids because of that? It was truly wonderful.
Do you think that when people write those things down, here's what I want, that maybe in some ways they don't know what some of the possibilities for what you can ask for or want ideally are, if they haven't seen a job description that looks like that, or worked with somebody who's had that thing or that attribute that they're looking for?
Yeah. But yeah, sometimes unless you've experienced it or been around it or gotten exposed to it somehow, sometimes you don't even know what you're supposed to be asking for. And you don't know that there's a better way of doing it, or there's a better way of living, or something like that. But if you've done enough of it, then that you can name it out exactly, then I find that is valuable.
Wasn't the AARP where you sort of got into configuration management and things of that nature? Or had you already been into that?
I was very much a Neolithic Cro-Magnon man when it came to my configuration management. It was all hand editing, bespoke, artisanal, created, all natural, organic files. And yeah, we got into Puppet and Chef at that time. We were doing our first explorations of cloud. We had all on-prem data centers at that time. And that was also my first experience. When I was in my job interview, the guy's like, okay, well, we were using a content management system called DayCQ. You ever heard of it? I'm like, absolutely not. And he's like, that's fine, we'll teach you. And soon after joining them, that software got purchased by Adobe, and that got developed into what's now called Adobe Experience Manager. Little did I know that would end up basically defining my career from that point until now. I'd been at AARP for quite some time, and I was doing really well at it. I enjoyed it. Wasn't looking for anything new particularly, but I was going into the office every day. I was commuting into downtown DC. And I got cold called by a recruiter, and they're like, yo, you want a job? I'm like, no, I got a job. And they're like, okay, well, so what do you think about Adobe Experience Manager? I'm like, it's a pig. It always breaks, falls apart all the time. I'm always having to restart it. They're like, oh, okay. Well, we're looking for a sysadmin that knows it. Would you like a full-time job doing it? I'm like, no, I'm already doing that. It's like, well, it's all remote. And this is at a time where nothing was remote. And I'm like, okay. And they're like, and this is how much it pays. I'm like, and it was a significant raise over what I was getting. I was like, all remote? Okay, I'm in. Even if I have to deal with this thing that I think is a pig, I'll deal with the pig if I can be full remote. But that was my first full remote job. And I have basically, with one exception, ever since then. This is 2012. I've been full remote ever since then.
So you grew to dress up that pig, put lipstick on it, and make it your friend.
Keep it in the house. Oh, yeah.
I want to know how you fell in love with that technology, because you've gone deep in it. You do a lot of content creation on it these days. So let's talk about what made it interesting to you, why you chose to place your focus there, and a little bit about how others listening can decide if it's time to go deep in an area, in something that catches them by surprise.
Yeah. So this absolutely caught me by surprise. It's a technology that I didn't know anything about. I'd done a lot of content management work before and big website work and so forth, but never in this tech. So it was all brand new. I guess one part that served to keep it interesting is that the main folks who use this particular type of content management system are almost entirely very large websites. It's focused on ones that rely heavily on cache, its ability to scale and so forth. This is not your typical WordPress site. So once again even though it had a proclivity for going down all the time, it once again was scratching my itch but there's a lot of traffic going on it and I could watch it go. Blinking lights, here we go, blinking lights again, drawing me in. They even let me go to the data center every so often and do stuff. All right, you got me.
Content management, does that mean text files, media, documents, all that stuff? Is that what we mean when we say content management?
So the typical problem being solved in content management, think something like Chevrolet.com, or think something like the Food Network, where your main content is recipes and videos and things like that, all having to be input somehow by non-technical people, because obviously the person writing a chicken recipe is not a developer, right? Or the person uploading the video showing how to make a turkey is not a developer. You have the problem that you're solving of how do you organize all that content in such a way that it's performant, it can store it all, it's findable. You don't go sending people off to redo photo shoots because they don't know that the photos are already in the system. It solves problems like, what if you need 6 different sizes of a photograph for different areas on the website? Solves problems like, what if you need different languages? And so you're going to have to send off exact copies of something for translation. Solves problems like, what if you are trying to build out a page purely based on the titles of content? So you're basically remixing content that you've already added. You've got titles and descriptions, and you're trying to pull those different pieces together. So you've got a number of those classes of problems that you're solving with a content management system, and you're trying to solve it. Also, this is where content management gets into digital experience, which is where you're also saying, well, not everybody who comes to my site should get the same thing every time. A new versus a returning customer, a person who's already purchased, a person who is getting a logged in experience. So you have to have mechanisms in place to be able to serve those experiences to those people. It gets really complicated. And so as a result, you need a system that is complicated. And whenever you have a complicated system, there's a million ways that it can break. Not only do you have a problem that's a really worthy problem, because it is, this is the other thing that also interests me about content management systems, and this one particularly, is that it's primarily the marketing site. And a marketing site on a company's page usually represents the hope of the company in the future. Everything's kind of pinned on this thing. And this is where I guess some of my previous experience in backend systems kind of came into play, because so there was a point in my career where I was I was an email sysadmin. And so I had Linux servers and this like Spam Assassin and these other things that would fall over every so often. And the problem with being an email sysadmin is that if there's too much spam coming through, then next thing you know, everybody from the president's office, the CEO is like, why am I getting so much spam? Like, solve it. Or if it's emails not coming through, then I'm supposed to have an email from this guy and it didn't come through. Solve it. Like, so basically, the very best you can possibly be is to be invisible. And also, nobody's going to be attributing the company's success to what you did. It's like, oh yeah, so our third quarter results are in, and Tad with his email system saved the day, right? Like, it's not going to happen. So it doesn't matter that it's still a fascinating technical problem to solve. And I still love email systems, but they can be unfulfilling as a result in some cases. Whereas marketing systems have all this hope tied to them. Like, you know what? Our company's right here, right now. But if we could just make this work, then we could be like here. And so there's all this hope for the future attached to them. You end up with all these kind of jazzy people that end up in those systems too, because they kind of feed off of that vibe a little bit too.
And it almost makes you feel like you have a real stake in the purpose of the company and the vision moving forward, because you were able to contribute in that way that is not invisible.
Right. It's true. There's various lessons that I've kind of learned all throughout the years, but one of those ones that has kind of fed into that is where you can end up getting feedback from that. Because sometimes when you're in systems, you end up getting a little bit separated from things like web analytics. And so to have somebody come back to you and say, do you realize that after the new website launch, you realize our conversion rates went up 3x after that? And you're going to go, dude, yes. All right.
Now we're talking.
Yeah, now we're talking. Or as an example, here's another example that also just really kind of had me jazzed at the time as a technical problem to solve. Okay, so I was doing work for Food Network. That was one of the ones I was on, right? Okay, they were on premise. So a problem that the Food Network has. So for a while, I don't know if it's actually still the case. This is a while ago, but they had like 4 or 5 first page search results for if you Googled turkey.
Wow.
And so a week before Thanksgiving, everybody in the United States forgets how to make turkey simultaneously. So the traffic on their website, 50 X's the week before Thanksgiving. So, and it stays there for a good 2-3 weeks and then tapers off. There's another spike in Christmas where everybody, again, forgets how to make turkey or ham. And then there's another spike at the Super Bowl where everybody forgets how to make nachos. But there were these massive spikes and we had on-premise gear. There's all these things we had to figure out about caching. We migrated to the cloud. It's my first big cloud migration. Being able to scale, that was a big deal. So there's a bunch of stuff that were just like, these were intense things to learn, out of the comfort zone stuff to learn, but still you're solving a really jazzy problem that is like, you're looking at the search traffic come in and you're like, look at the sheer number of people that are handling this. I mean, fine, it's not Facebook or something like that. I mean, I'm sure those guys get to deal with traffic numbers that would completely dwarf anything that I was working on, but still, I thought it was pretty cool.
Part of the mission of our show is to educate our listeners on the different types of roles that you could have in technology based on the experience you have today. So after you listen to that, would you say that a consultant is the same thing as a contractor? Let's just break that down for the sake of clarity. If I'm a consultant, likely I work for a consulting firm, a company whose business model is doing consulting or services work for another company. And it's probably very good if you like the dynamic nature of work, if you like to work with different customers, because you're going to go from project to project, probably within a focused area of specialization, and do implementation work, architecture work, whatever it is. But you work for that specific consulting firm, and they put you on whatever project is next in line in their work pipeline. And you may or may not have a responsibility to go out and get new consulting work for your company. They may have a dedicated sales team who goes and gets new engagements from existing or new customers. Of course, part of your helping the longevity of your firm or helping your firm increase revenue would be doing good work, building good relationships with the customers you work with, building a good personal brand so that it helps your company make a difference and increase revenue. And then there's contract work. So let's take the company that is not, they don't have a business model of consulting for other companies. It's company XYZ, they make widgets, for example, and they need a consultant for a specific project for 6 months. Maybe it's a project manager for some new technology venture that they're doing, new technology project that they're doing, or it's 3 months, or it's 9 months. So you work for this company on a contract basis, not on full payroll. So while you're working that, you are needing to look for your next job before that one runs out so you don't have a gap in income. Whereas if you work for a consulting firm full time, assuming that consulting firm is doing well and they have enough work coming in for you to stay employed, you just continue to work for them. You may not have to hunt for a new job as much as if you were a contractor for different companies and just did contract work. So there are contract job listings on LinkedIn and other job platforms, even on company websites. I'm sure you can find this. So just note the differences. There are certainly some similarities. Tad talked about being intentional about his life circumstances and whether it actually made sense to do a job in the consulting world. Were you surprised in the way that Tad progressed into working on Adobe Experience Manager? I actually think it's pretty logical, and it turned out to be a bit of what we call an adjacency. He had already done web development. He already knew the system side of web servers, and he already knew and understood how to use web trends, looking at analytics from web servers. So it's another piece of that holistic system that I think is just a natural adjacent slide in. Lucky for him, he was willing to say yes to go and focus on this thing that maybe at first he didn't like that much, but working on Adobe Experience Manager, working on the content management system, it allowed and still allows him to make the kind of impacts he wants. The blinking lights, looking at the metrics, watching the system go. Oh, by the way, Cold Fusion, when you heard that, did you think Adobe? Because it is an Adobe language. I don't know if it was at the time that we talked about it, but I thought that was an interesting coincidence. I hope you enjoyed part 2 of the discussion with Tad. We'll get to hear more about his story next week. Catch you later.
Farewell, listeners. Tune in next time as the journey continues. I'm John White at VJourneyman, for Nick Cordy at NetworkNerd_, signing off.
Adios.